Welcome back to our listeners and viewers of the Responsible Edge podcast, brought to you by the Andrew Greenwald Charter. Today, we're learning how procurement, often perceived as a backstage function, might just hold the keys to climate leadership. And we're starting with an article by Klupify, Sustainable Procurement Driving Value, Innovation and Resilience in Modern Business, which makes the case that procurement is no longer just about buying, it's about shaping our future. And to unpack all of this, I'm absolutely delighted to say I'm joined by Will Ennett, a chartered environmentalist and former head of sustainability and ESG at TalkTalk. And as of today, hot off the press, recognized as one of the top 100 most impactful environmental professionals in the UK on the ENDS Report Power List. Will, it's absolutely fantastic to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Charlie.
Top man. Now, Will, I should say that it literally has been announced today, your recognition as being one of the most impactful environmental professionals in the UK. Just for our listeners that want to find out a little bit more about that, can you briefly just explain, what's that recognised and what that's involved?
Yeah, so thank you. I was very fortunate to be nominated by some colleagues and peers for the recognition. Really, one of the key things that the award recognised was the work we did at a cross-industry level, where we brought together companies representing about £50 billion of turnover, government and the regulator. And in particular, we did a lot of work focusing on the largest source of our emissions, the supply chain. And so that's probably the key focus of the discussion today, right? About how can what we buy as companies really make a material difference in creating a better world and hopefully helping to avert the worst of climate change.
Well, you're a podcaster's dream. You're already segueing things in and giving sort of titillations to what we're going to cover in the rest of the conversation. So absolutely fantastic. Well, congratulations again on the recognition. Well deserved. Let's start, though, now, for those of our listeners and viewers who aren't aware of you and your work. I want to go back to the very beginning. I want to go back to the kind of the formative experiences, those things that have really helped shape your view of the world and have ultimately led you to do what you've done so far in your career. So take us back to wherever you want to start. But just give us a flavor as to you and your journey.
Yeah, probably two reflections at two particular moments in time. So I think the first is that I'm sure many of your guests will have had a formative experience with nature or with, environment or maybe recycling. And I have to confess, I don't remember that as much as a child. I certainly remember some elements of it. But my childhood, I was counting this up the other day. Certainly about 12 schools, maybe more. I don't know. I moved around a lot as a kid, and was never expelled from anywhere. But I think so. It wasn't sort of that way inclined. It was just generally we moved around a lot. But I think one of the things that teach you is real openness and curiosity, and you have to sort of start again and take things from a new, fresh perspective. So I'd like to think that I've always had a fairly sort of open and curious mindset, which I think is really important in this sector, right? Because, it is all about learning and finding out new things, and standards and ways we perceive things change all the time. And so we have to sort of keep up to date. But to be honest, no, I've had a career over 20 years, all of it pretty much in telecoms and media and technology. But I think the formative period, so for me to move into sustainability was probably a lot later on, which was about 6 or so years ago. So after doing a lot of commercial roles, a lot of senior management roles, I guess I was reflecting on what next and where to go next. And I think life events are probably the big changes, right? So in my case, it was probably with children, but I don't think it's a case of being at the hospital and seeing the eyes of your child and then getting a tear in your eye trying to save the world. It's probably more just maybe the chaos of it all and just the life event and all the changes. And it was probably more the second child sort of created that stimulus where you go, right, well, actually, I had maybe had a lifestyle which previously was very focused and, on my own terms. And I think now when those life events happen, you reevaluate and then you think about what else I can do. So, yeah, I mean, I wonder from your perspective, was that something that ever happened to you? Or, you've obviously interviewed 150 guests. I mean, how regular is that? Or is it typically that people have this nature-based a childhood formative experience which has shaped their lives?
Do you know what, Will? It's a brilliant question, and thank you so much for asking. And I've got many that I want to come back to you with in terms of what you've just shared. But I think I've noticed sort of two groups really. You do have those that, there's the sense of, I always knew that, I wanted to work in the space, and it was always a sort of a drive and determination. And in particular, people that, had that drive and determination before, sustainability, if you like, was really a sort of a clear career choice. The pioneers of 20, 25 years ago, people saying, no, it was a new course and it was something I was attracted to because it aligned with my, my interest in the environment and with, things around me and nature and the preservation of it. So you very much get those. And then you get the other group, which is very much aligned with what you've just described, where there's a pivot point, a crucial pivot point at some point in somebody's career. And, whether or not it's brought on by life events or whether or not it's brought on by just a sort of a very sort of seamless transition, if you like, from a very commercially focused, experience through to, well, what else is there? What does impact during the rest of my career look like? So I think for me personally, like, I very much fall into the same camp as you. And I think a lot of marketeers and comms people probably find themselves in a similar position whereby, you sort of start out with the intention to sell as many widgets as you possibly can. And then you work really, really hard to get proficient at selling widgets. And then you sell a few widgets and people tell you, oh, you're good at selling widgets. You've learned how to do that. That's brilliant. And then there's that sort of vacancy of a sense of value. And you think, what have I really contributed here? And that for me was the pivot point that was aligned perfectly with the CMA's Green Claims Code and everything that kind of came thereafter. But let me take you back to you. Brilliant reversal already in the podcasting stakes. But let me take you back to you. You mentioned the sort of the commercial career up until or the commercially focused roles, if you like, and leadership roles that you were in up until sort of 5-6 years ago. Telecoms and technology, etc. Why that area? Why was that of particular interest to you during the best part of your career?
Yeah, probably something more I not fell into. That's not right, but I think I probably wanted to be a journalist, and I remember doing some work, and also at university, radio stations and things like that. And actually remember one news organization, international news organization I was working for early in my career. And I remember that there was the news floor, which was great and exciting. But I remember like the floor above was like the management, right? And so they ran the channels, the news channels, but also all the other international channels they ran. And sometimes I would speak to those people. And obviously for nearly everyone else, they were like the boring people in suits. But actually, I was like quite fascinated by, right, how do they make it work? I mean, they are as essential as the journalists. And so that sort of attracted my interest, and that's the area I went in and ended up doing a lot of, commercial deals, particularly on, TV, media, and then, telecommunications as well, space.
I have to say, I knew, having spoken to you a couple of times now, that you must have had a background in radio or journalism. Just to hear that voice, Will, that comes through, that the voice is one of radio for sure. Let's talk a little bit about sustainability then. So yeah. You've got you mentioned your second child, the impact of that and the impact of, right, well, what am I going to do next? What does impact look like? What was it about sustainability beyond just a realization that you wanted to do something else? Like, what was it that really attracted you to that sort of role?
Yeah, well, I think, as I said, when you have those, part of thinking about the career is almost going a bit like what you were saying with your marketing experience. I mean, do you want to continue on to the next step and to the next step? Do you want maybe to be a CMO And I guess for me, it was probably like, I actually kind of don't. And I had always had an interest in sustainability. I remember being on the marches for the COP in Copenhagen all those years ago, if you remember that, which is way before Paris. And but there obviously we're not anywhere near the same level of the amount of roles. And whereas nowadays any large company will have some form of sustainability team or some form of consultancy to deal with that. Obviously, looking back 15, 20 years, that was simply not the case, right? It'd be much more constrained. So one is just market opportunity, right? That there was just more opportunity. And if you kind of fast forward to around 2020, particularly, I think in the UK, what really helped was the fact that there was the COP, the COP conference coming up in Glasgow, which was 2020, if you remember, then got postponed to 2021. And so that led to, I think, a lot of companies thinking about the issue, potentially setting targets. So it was a case where there was a nice alignment of both that purpose to do something, but actually being able to make a decent business case, right? To show that investors had maybe made commitments, and those commitments were likely to then cascade down to those portfolio companies, whether it's their debt or their investments, or whether it's customers as well. So the business I was at had a mix of both B2B and B2C, and particularly in the B2B, the business environment, where again, if lots of businesses commit, then it is likely that those obligations will cascade down into as a supplier.
And we'll add, discussing the sort of the context, if you like, in which you found yourself moving into sustainability. Like, what was your experience of the role like? I mean, did it immediately kind of fulfill all of those sort of burning intentions that you were looking for in your professional life, or what surprised you about the experience of moving into a senior sustainability role?
Well, I think it was, on the one hand, what was great was ultimate freedom, right? Now there was no set path on what to do, how to prioritize. Every decision was based on me. I think what was quite interesting is it's probably a bit lonelier maybe than traditional commercial roles, right? So on the one hand, I used to run a business unit, had 1 million customers, so lots of pressure. All those senior management know where you are. They want to know every week how your numbers are doing, how you're performing. So there's pressure with it, but you're very included. And then I guess you move into the sustainability role. It's not like you're forgotten, because hopefully, one's track record will, speak for itself, and you still have the contacts, but you're a little bit more like kind of knocking on the glass from the outside, saying, "Hey, what about this? What about that? Can we try something new?" And there's a lot of goodwill often, but it is ultimately a lonelier path, right? Because you are starting out from new within the organization. You don't have the and also I shared a team. I used to have a team, and then certainly in the early stages, I didn't have a team. And again, that was on the one hand liberating, because there's so much work that that's involved in being a people manager, right? It's a significant additional responsibility, but at the same time, it means that you probably have less people to bounce ideas off and to work with.
It's super interesting to hear you talk, because I mean, I've had so many conversations with people about talking about if you're going to get sustainability right within certainly any size of organization, but in particular a large organization, the key is to make sure that it's not a bolted on function, but it's something that's ingrained as much as it possibly can be in all aspects of the organization. What was that like, kind of trying to develop, if you like, and to get more ingrained and being part of the conversation and not having to tap on the window? Like, what was that experience like of trying to shift the dial, if you like, in terms of the adoption of some of these things?
Yeah, well, I think a huge amount of trial and error, right? And that's the reality, is that you will always hear people talk about, largely their successes and what everything went well. But the reality is that not every internal initiative, not every internal program is going to work. And I think, being very candid, probably in the early days, I think the mistake I made was probably, let's call it, capturing imagination over governance. And I've just sort of made that up now. But I think what I mean by that is we probably developed some great kind of internal engagement. Let's call it like, let's say a launch of a policy, got lots of employees excited. But potentially some of those employees then didn't necessarily have a clear outlet of how to funnel that energy and enthusiasm and sustainability into their day jobs. And I think that was just being very candid and probably a learning. So what we then really tried to do is go back and look at, right, well, how do we create governance and how do we create structures that can really, really work? And this might be, again, another segue into what we're talking about with sustainable procurement. But although I had lots of commercial experience and I used to do a lot of contracting, deal making, supplier engagement, I was never officially in the procurement teams. I was more like a commercial person, but I sort of knew that area very well. But so like a classic procurement is not my background. But anyway, the point is when we then took a step back and actually looked at, right, well, what targets have we set and what do we need to do? Like so many companies globally, the supply chain emissions were by far the largest. And so we needed to take a step and look at that. And then when I looked at that, I went, actually, that is actually brilliant for our business because, yes, we had a great, strong procurement function doing great jobs. As many companies will recognize, many individuals will recognize that buying and sourcing of goods and services happens across the business. It doesn't just happen in the procurement function. So potentially this could be a great thing to leverage, A, because it's very impactful, but B, because actually we could set targets by department. And it's a way to have that outlet so that if anyone's genuinely interested and wants to bring it forward, if they're spending any amount of money, it could be £5,000 or 100,000, or whatever it is, if they're involved in setting the scope, because it's not just procurement people. Imagine, let's say, a technology department might set the scope for, there was great opportunity. So that I found like a really excellent sort of avenue of how we could then run through. And then, and then we sort of backed that up by having proper governance in place. And principally, I managed to persuade management, and so the CEO was very supportive to allow this. Is that one of the metrics that make up the bonus was based on climate, and so again, that meant that all of a sudden there's so much more governance behind it. So that if interested, there's a headline target, in our case, a science-based target, backed by an annual target, which is part of remuneration, backed by a committee of people from all because even though the contribution of the different departments might be different, they can all have a sub-target that leads into it. And then, everyone could lead in. So, I got more serious on structure, over emotion and kind of engagement.
And Will, that was brilliantly explained, by the way. And what I particularly like about it, and tell me if I've got it completely wrong in terms of what you've just described, but that whole idea that through the act of procurement, not just through the procurement department, but through other departments within the organization that take procurement actions themselves, that it's almost sort of the gateway to introducing them to sustainability and the role of sustainability that perhaps then can look to influence other areas of their function and their activity beyond their purchasing habits and who they choose to work with. Is that a fair synopsis, that it's almost like a gateway opportunity?
Absolutely. I think that's correct. And I also think when you look at a lot of modern companies, particularly let's say in services industries, what they buy and how they buy is so important as well. Because if you think about how they buy it, that's where the procurement team will often receive the specification, and obviously they'll be involved in that process, right? But ultimately, many of them will receive the brief, and they will shape the brief and make sure that they can then execute and do their job and get the best product at the criteria set out. Price being typically one of them, but there might be other criteria that are met. So if we can also intervene that a little bit earlier, thinking about, for example, product design, right? How do we drive waste out of the design? How do we change our business models or our commercials to maybe try and reduce, again, that could be waste, but it could be energy efficiency, whatever the the particular variable is. So yeah, I think, as you say, it's such a huge opportunity, and I also, on reflection, I think another really important point is it's in an existing language. And what I mean by that is we're talking about pounds and pence or dollars or whatever your currency is. We're talking about spend. And I think across the organization, you could be in marketing, sales, commercial, technology, operations. You understand budgets. Talking about carbon footprint, emissions, and by the way, numbers which change a lot as well in Scope 3. We have the constant baselining and with new data, which is the right thing to do, is to update it. Becomes a lot harder. So I think that's another thing that's often overlooked, is that if you can tag it to spend, it's so much easier for people across the organization to grasp, and then to try and make it ingrained, as you say, into people's thinking.
I love that, Will. I love that. Such a good point. And it's that, it's the accessibility of thinking in a sustainable way via the pound and penny approach. Now, we are pretty much already into all things procurement and sustainable procurement, which obviously we've alluded to is what we're going to focus on in terms of the article this week. I've got one more question for you personally before we head over onto that piece. When you're at this moment now, where you're thinking about and considering what happens next. When you think about the rest of your career from this point onwards, Will, what would success look like at the end of it?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. And I think, so I think a few things. I think impact, it's probably the number one metric. What's the next thing we can do, or I can do? And it might not be immediate, by the way, it might be over time. That can have a great impact, because we do have lots of deadlines looming over the next 5 years, as is often said, 2030, but beyond that as well. So I think that's the first thing. And then the second thing is probably that continuous learning. Actually, I really enjoyed learning about these areas. I think there's lots of new topics. I think at the same time, we also need to execute on what we've already committed to. So sometimes the discourse can be a bit like, well, you see those things on LinkedIn about like the climate tunnel vision. And I kind of always want to respond to that. Yes, but can we just execute upon that rather than adding another 10 things, right? So we do need to execute, but there will also at the same time be new learning, right? And so, I'm not trying to be too myopic, but so I think learning is the second thing. So yeah, and then it's interesting with that list. What's not on there is, is status. I probably don't need to be the next CEO or well, money's always good. So I'll come back on that one. But certainly I probably, I have in my head, I have a number and I don't need to go above the number, if that makes sense. So I'm not sort of chasing, multiples upon multiples. So that for me is what success is. And I think sort of the final thing is, I don't know if you've read, there's a great book, The 100-Year Life or The 100-Year Career. I don't know if you've read that one. I read that a good number of years ago, and it definitely influenced me, which is, actually, I think there will be. So first of all, I don't think I'll retire. The retirement age will probably be a lot later. And so I think if you are going to do that, you can't sustain it at the pace of full-time, 5 days a week, let's say beyond 40 hours or whatever, for such an elongated period of time. So what that means in practice is, I think firstly, it'll be, there might be some kind of peaks and troughs. And the second thing is there might be some more career pivots. So I think I can't. I think one could not be in any way certain that what I'm doing now I'd still be doing in 10 years, because I just think the way of modern work. So I appreciate that's a much more grander picture thought process. But yeah, that for me is also reality. Is that if I'm still doing what I'm doing in 10 years and it's my choice, great. But I don't bank on that or believe that that's in any way certain, because, as you say, it could just be, and the best case scenario is sustainability is so ingrained in every business that there's no need for these professionals. The more likely scenario is a mix of technological change and other changes mean that the roles have morphed into something that could be quite different.
And what's so sort of stands out from what you've just described? And again, you talk about, you asked about what are some of the commonalities, I know, in reference to the sort of inspiration of some of the sort of senior sustainability professionals that I've had the pleasure of kind of speaking to while doing the show. One of the absolute clearest commonalities is this whole a curiosity mindset, a leaning into new learning, a leaning into being attracted to opportunities to evolve and to understand things in a more kind of holistic manner when it comes to sustainability and new innovative ways of doing things. So I think that rings so true, that you don't know where those learnings are likely to lead you to and perhaps pivot you at some stage. But Will, that was absolutely brilliant. Again, it was a whistle-stop tour for all of our listeners and viewers that want to check out, Will's LinkedIn profile, etc. We'll obviously be linking to that, so you guys can go and see and give him his celebratory likes or claps relating to most recent recognition. For now, though, Will, let's move forward. And if possible, would you mind just providing a bit of a summary, an overview of the piece that we alluded to at the start of the show, and perhaps just picking out whatever you thought were the most interesting points made within it?
Yeah, so the article, I'm just referring to my notes here. The article, it was all about sustainable procurement. So that's, I think, the thing to talk about. And in particular, there was sort of three areas highlighted: the economic advantage of doing so, risk management and reputation, and then innovation and collaboration. And I think, if you'll indulge me, Charlie, I could start probably with the third one first, which is collaboration, and talk a bit more about that, about what we did at a cross-industry level. Because I actually think that's probably one of the really key bits that you hear a lot about, a lot of platitudes, a lot of warm words spoken at conferences, limited in terms of actual, right, how is it done? What does it mean? What are the difficulties? And again, maybe I can sort of lay some of them bare and be honest about the success and the pitfalls. But so for me, I mean,
Will, sorry to interrupt you. I've interrupted you horribly here, but just before you go into that, which I absolutely want you to, and I think what our listeners and viewers will be so intrigued by is working at the scale and the level that you've worked in to understand the practicalities and the realities of things such as collaboration and partnership. But let me just ask you a bigger, broader question on this. This piece was written in November last year. One of my perhaps ill-informed views when I read this piece was, of course, do we not know this already? Have we not known this for however, 10, 15, 20 years? Did you have a sense of that at all when reading this article? Or do you think that people really don't get still the power and the impact of what it is to choose who you ultimately buy from and supply with?
Well, I think people do, but obviously it's still not fully embedded in the process. And I think there's a few angles to it. One of the other roles I have, voluntary role is with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, and so involved in the sort of UK chapter, and that is obviously a grouping that really wants to engage procurement professionals to embed sustainable practices and sustainable procurement into the way they operate. And I think when we run events and we've seen things clearly, there are many companies that do have that, and they will already have not just sustainability leads, but sustainable procurement leads within the procurement. But so there's still two gaps, which is within procurement at a large organization. There's often going to be cases, happen with myself as well, where sustainability, for whatever reason, is overlooked as a consideration in purchasing, even with existing processes. And secondly, obviously, lots of companies where it's not even a consideration yet. So yes, I agree that in some respects there was nothing groundbreaking, and it is not in any way derogatory to the authors, but there's nothing groundbreaking in that. But there's also maybe a gap between action. So there's still plenty to play for there.
And hence why actually continuing to have these types of conversations and raising awareness of the function, the need, and the opportunity with sustainable procurement is so important, and why our conversation today is valuable. I interrupted you brutally though. Let's go back to you wanted to start with the collaboration and partnership element of the article alluded to. Just take us through, your reflections on that.
Yeah, so I think just again, I probably started off. If you look at the problem that we had, so the challenge, which I guess was self-imposed because I championed this through the business, was to set science-based targets. And, to effectively do science-based targets, you need to include scope 3. And that means really you're probably going to focus in then on your suppliers, right? Now, actually, if I can maybe use this as a slight deviation, because we talk, again, I've been to lots of panels talking about collaboration on a very platitudinal, vague basis. I've not been to many panels that talk about the importance of competition. And that's maybe one thing that I would attribute to, certainly in my experience, things like science-based targets. So what made the business case so easy was being able to say that competitor A, B, and C have it. If we don't have it, we risk X, Y, and Z. And that could be particularly B2B, customer revenues, it could just be FOMO, whatever it might be. So actually, I think sometimes there's a place for competition, and let's recognize that and say appreciate sometimes. Obviously, there's the worst impacts of capitalism, and in a highly competitive landscape, it could be against sustainable practices, but often it can favor it, right? And so if we can turn the dialogue around, so maybe that's one asterisk to say is let's not forget the power of competition. But yeah, so we'd set these targets, and actually, then when you look at it, you got the supply chain. But then actually what's quite interesting is you can look at your suppliers, you gauge your suppliers. But when I was looking through the data and going, right, how do I actually make an impact? I was coming back to two things. And the first one was, well, actually, it would be so much easier if our competitors were doing the same. Many of our suppliers were, the same, many of the same companies were applying in, or the same is probably not the right word, but similar. If there was some level of alignment, and then the second aspect is actually then when we started talking, and I've noticed this is there's some industries probably like telecoms where there's a huge amount of unusual relationships. And when we look at it, most of our competitors are at the same time suppliers to us and customers at the same. So we're three simultaneously. Now you get some sectors and industries where there's a very clear dividing line. But I think increasingly a lot of sectors have that, right? Particularly where there's a mix of B2C, which maybe competitors are probably more strictly competitors. But in the B2B environment, many are suppliers and customers. So if I can give you one very practical example, is that if you go into a McDonald's and you get your Wi-Fi, there will be one large, well-known brand that is the lead, supplier of that. But actually, often many of the other brands are involved, maybe servicing some stores, servicing some elements of the network. So so that's why there's it's sort of an unusual relationships there. And so for those two reasons, actually, there were suppliers and customers at the same time. So we had to engage them. And it would be the more we could collaborate, the more opportunity we've got to make meaningful change. That's what kind of really inspired me to establish and chair this working group. So the forum was the Digital Connectivity Forum, which is a well-run existing forum who are doing fantastic work, and we set up the specific group on climate.
And Will, sorry to jump in, but just so I'm absolutely clear, the observation that you made was, yes, there was real complexity in terms of these organizations being one and another in terms of supplier, in terms of customer, et cetera, but the requirement really was to try and find a way of standardizing as much as possible the approaches to reporting and monitoring so that we could ultimately begin to compare apples with apples and start to create clear strategies for, decarbonization of the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. Have I understood that all correctly, or have I misunderstood?
No, that's absolutely right. I think it's probably even more basic, which is as an individual company to try and reach your goals. I think what you then start to realize is actually the supply chain is very much dependent on people within our existing ecosystem, rather than people or companies in different countries and in completely different sectors where we had where maybe there wasn't as much kind of commonality. In fact, by dealing with people where there was a lot of commonality is where we could potentially make real inroads.
I'm with you. Okay, so the proximity of the opportunity to influence change and to influence progress, that was one of your observations. Wow, the opportunity really is here, which is hence why the working group was something that you really kind of
that's right. And I think that a few learnings. I think one of the big learnings is we spent a long time getting the right audience, and everyone was incredibly collaborative. So, my peers were very welcome and really welcomed the opportunity and created terms of reference. But then I have to be honest, probably at the beginning, I sort of struggled then to make inroads. And I think what it shows is, again, that thing of just saying, let's collaborate is not good enough. You actually have to have a proper plan of work and demonstrate what it is that is going to make a difference to each individual company's decarbonization journey, and at the same time the sector, if that makes sense. And that's why particularly supply chain, given just how challenging it is one where there's a lot of potential.
And on that front of trying to convince organizations across the supply chain to get involved in a collaborative initiative such as that, you mentioned that providing them with some clarity around what are they going to actually get from it, what's in it for them is core and fundamental. But what else? What else gets them to the party, if you like? And what other lessons did you learn about how to get the most out of those collaborative partners? Because I think this is the crux of it. As you alluded to, there's so much nice words and lots of lovely talking about collaboration and partnership, but this is like, how do you actually make this thing happen in reality?
Yeah. So I think, as you say, what's in it for the companies? I also think I probably tried to do too much myself, and but just to kind of keep it moving. And actually, the more there was genuine delegation, that I think that really helped as well. So that way, of course, then others can feel real ownership. Now, the challenge with that is that these people also have their own, very stressful, high performing jobs in their own companies. But so there's always a balance there. But by and large, those were the two areas there where you can then make real progress. And again, we were very lucky in that with the forum, there's full-time staff who are excellent to help continue to drive the agenda. And I think as well, it's a momentum builder, isn't it? That's the other point, which is if you can land a few things, then you demonstrate and you create a track record, and that really helps. What I would say though, on slightly contradict myself, my other learning is things take time, right? Particularly if you want to get 10 companies to sign up to something, it takes time. Some of the initiatives involved, understandably and absolutely correctly, real rigor around competition law, right? Obviously we never shared anything sensitive, but also that there was nothing kind of untoward. So that naturally takes time. So it's worth, probably one other lesson though is making sure that whatever you do, you might as well make it meaningful, because if it is going to take a while, there's no point doing a very, very small incremental change.
Interesting. So go, be bold and be ambitious with what you're trying to, because it could take some time to come to fruition anyway.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go as far as kind of go big or go home, but certainly because there will be, and it's also the appetite level, right? So part of the thing is also exploring, right? And you can explore different areas, and there'll be somewhere there's just not an appetite to do things, and that's no one company; it's just across the board, and that's absolutely fine as well, right? So there'll be some initiatives which are just simply just too big, but to try and go as big as you reasonably can, rather than maybe try and say, well, if I can just do this really one small change now and then I'll build up, because the small change will probably take a little while anyway.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That, yes, not good to go bold or go home, but certainly be aware of the significance of the time and the resource and the input, and therefore what you're trying to achieve with the initiative. you alluded to, Will, when you talked about the article, the kind of 3 key areas, and obviously we've jumped to number 3. Just take us through, perhaps, and just touch upon the other 2, and just draw upon your own experience when introducing them as well.
Yeah, so there was one about the economic advantages of sustainable procurement. And, my reflection on this is that there will be economic advantages in terms of, mapping the supply chain, understanding, probably over the last, let's say, 3 to 4 years, most companies have reconsidered their supply chain in response to geopolitical events and geopolitical uncertainty. So some of the sustainability work may have helped with that mapping. I look at it, and I guess from a sustainability only point of view, and this is probably more of a budgetary thing. If you think about, right, I've got a decarbonization plan, I've got, let's say, a net zero plan, I've got to get from A to B. There'll largely be 2 components, right? Your operational emissions, your scope 1 and 2, and then your scope 3. To put in place a supplier engagement program is probably a longer term effort in that, you won't necessarily yield immediate results. But it's not a big CapEx effort. So, and if you compare that maybe to operations, so in our case, we had some fabulous progress and deliveries on energy efficiency in data centers, right? So we cut our energy consumption by about 30% over 5 years, which is fabulous. And so all of that obviously is win-win, right? You reduce your emissions, you reduce your energy, you reduce your cost base. But then, inevitably you do come to more harder decisions around CapEx spend, around that more, actually changing the way things are operated into a lower carbon model. And some of them get approved, some of them don't. Some of the progress is quick, some of it isn't. So I think there's a real benefit of the supplier engagement program running alongside, because that is a very different type of expenditure. For most people, it's not that big upfront CapEx. It's largely kind of maybe a headcount one. And then, again, at a slightly different timeline, yes, that's when maybe probably I would say for the next couple of years, there's still lots of headroom for companies just to engage with their suppliers more, to get to a high degree of suppliers who have, let's say, themselves set science-based targets or other net zero goals. There's a lot of that to go at before you get into the really more financially difficult discussions around changing materials, insetting, so maybe providing financial assistance to suppliers. So I think there's an interesting parallel there as well, where there's an economic advantage there too, which is it's probably particularly for companies starting out, a relatively low cost way of starting to make impact on climate measures.
Low-hanging fruit comes to mind as an overused term, but yes, an opportunity to start as you mean to go on in this sense. What does on that point? Again, sorry, slightly segueing out of what we were just discussing, but what does, in your mind, what's the core characteristics of a successful approach that an organization can take to engagement with their suppliers when it comes to sustainability? Like, what are the major? You mentioned science-based targets. You mentioned trying to get your suppliers to adopt similar ways of reporting. How do you do that successfully?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can only share my own learning. So I think the first learning I had was, we had a B2B business as well, and so we would get a lot of surveys from customers asking us to fill out, 100-page ESG survey and this and that. And needless to say, that wasn't the highlight of my week. So one of my big things was I'd like to actually send no surveys, or if I can, to make it as unbureaucratic as possible. And again, to try and get to the nub of what we wanted to do, because what we wanted to do was decarbonize in our supply chain. There were other information which we received in surveys which would be extraneous for us, right? We're just not relevant. So that was the first thing, really, really limited. So that was the philosophy I came in with, is how can we do that? And really what we did is, with procurement, really look through the list, how we spend, what we're planning to spend, how that's going to change. And then segment all right, where is the most emissions? And then break that down into about 5 to 8 different like key sectors. And then actually, rather than starting to send out, we actually engage with them. So again, that was my advantage of also being in the company for quite a while before I took on the role is I dealt with many of the companies, or I sort of knew who was responsible. And so we just had one-on-one conversations. And rather than saying, right, we want you to do this, it's more like, what are your pressure points as a business generally?
Mm-hmm.
So what's kind of happening in your sector? What are your financials like? Who are your big customers? And what are you, and what are you feeling from them, and how are you moving? And so understanding that then meant that when we then went out to the rest of the people in that segmentation, it was a much more nuanced understanding of, and a much more about, right, we're going to ask you to do this and here are the benefits, backed up by, maybe cross-industry work, but rather than here's a form you must complete. And I found that worked, incredibly effectively for us. And certainly one metric we had is supplier engagement. So 85% of our suppliers by spend had set targets, which is, really high. And, to bring it to life, I remember one particular segment was we had outsourced a lot of customer contacts. So it could be, call centers or people who run, chat for you. And that was through a range of companies, globally spread. And again, just understanding their pressure points, also understanding who their clients were, because so many of them had large clients in insurance, utilities, other sectors. And we were able to connect the dots and demonstrate, right, well, this request is coming from us, but actually we're willing to be flexible and sort of harmonize the request so that it aligns with maybe some of your bigger insurance clients or other clients from other sectors. Okay. That kind of meant that all of a sudden there was a lot more goodwill and like, okay, we get it. We understand what we're trying to do, and how do we drive forward into making kind of positive things, rather than, you've never heard from me, I send a questionnaire, it's 100 pages, 100 questions. So
it's creating, sorry, Will, but it's having a sensitivity and a compassion and an empathy in many ways for your suppliers, and wanting to understand their circumstances, and then adapting the way that you're approaching them to hopefully find a solution that's mutually beneficial. And that's what you're ultimately trying to achieve when you're engaging with them on this. Yeah,
that's right. And I mean, how scalable it is, I don't know. I mean, I can imagine certainly companies with a supply base in the hundreds or the thousands, I think it's perfectly scalable, because again, as you say, you take a few of the big ones, you understand, and then you use that segmentation for those people, for the companies in that sector.
Yeah.
Once you get to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of suppliers, it might not be, as easy to do. I grant that. Yeah.
Well, but you would hope, wouldn't you, that this is such important stuff, and that, yes, hopefully there are ways of trying to adopt that approach, that sort of that more customized approach as much as possible. Let's touch upon, you can see, Will, that we've obliterated timescales. I've got my production guys in. No, it's me, because you've got it's too interesting, and I'd much rather carry on asking the questions. Let's just touch on that, on the third element within the article, if possible. When you alluded to it before, are we talking here about data and the role of data, or what was
it was the role of risk management and reputation. And again, what I found is, let's say as a large corporate, you have obligations. And one of our obligations was climate-related financial disclosures. So this was it's based on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so TCFD. You'll often hear about. And we had a requirement to list and report on that. And I think some of the supplier engagement work meant that was actually really a lot easier than it could otherwise have been, because we had spoken to suppliers about the issues of sustainability, understand some of their challenges, what were their barriers to setting targets, and in those conversations, what would come through is some of the climate risks, maybe that some suppliers were already experiencing, how potentially they were diversifying, for example, manufacturing centers or facilities to meet existing or soon to be predicted challenges with physical risks to some of those assets. So What that meant is that, when we were looking at our climate-related risks, which include across your value chain, it's, how does the regulatory landscape change? How does your supplier landscape change? We already had some good knowledge and understanding. So, it certainly really helped us that way. For me personally, I don't think so much the reputation side, but again, that is a sector by sector, right? You imagine there are certain sectors which have much more exposure to high risk of both environmental and social challenges in their supply base. So it's not to say that it doesn't happen for telecoms, but there's probably a lower risk.
But it's fair to say, is it not, that when you package the whole proposition together of sustainable procurement, looking at all of the factors that we've been through, that really it's one of those challenges that if as soon as you start, you're beginning to protect yourself both from a risk and a reputational perspective. So again, coming back to your point about the low-hanging fruit nature of beginning to invest time and energy and effort in this, the call to arms, if you like, for organizations out there is start and do it now.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what I would add to that is I think what was useful for us is rather than do it as a simple data collection exercise, which is if we just collect lots of data on customers, that I think can naturally mean there's a lack of urgency and a lack of real momentum. Whereas if you had a target, in our case, supplier engagement targets, what percentage of customers have set a science-based target? I appreciate that. It then is very focused on emissions and it maybe removes some of the others. But if you can set those type of targets, then it drives momentum. So that would be my corollary to it.
Brilliant. Well, that's our call to arms, Will, if you like, for organizations that are listening in and interested in this area. As mentioned before, we've rattled through our time. I know I've only been able to scratch the surface with you, but hopefully, Will, you've had a good time and we might be able to snaffle you for another show in the future. In the meantime, though, let's conclude with the magic wand. I am fascinated to see what you're going to do with this. Will, if I was to hand you a magic wand, you've changed one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
I think it's looking beyond the four walls, right? So I remember that when I was starting out to pitch things like science-based targets or net zero targets, understandably, people weren't used to it, right? And they're thinking, well, why do we care about our suppliers? That's their business, and there's a rationale to that as well, right? We focus on our business, they focus on theirs. We shouldn't be telling them what to do. So I can certainly see the sense in that. But actually, if businesses can do that and can think a bit more holistically, then I think both there's all those benefits we talked about, vis-a-vis the article. But also it's that ripple effect, isn't it? If we can all influence each other to take those actions on sustainable business, what an impact we could have and how much quicker we can get to hopefully reversing our kind of increasing global warming.
Well, I love it. I give out here's for those guests that I think nail a suggestion, a brilliant one. Let me throw something back at you though in light of that. What leads to that in your mind? In terms of getting to the point where we do have more of a collective leadership, if you like, of the world's most impactful organizations and businesses. How do we get to the point where there is that collective sort of holistic view and appreciation, if you like, of the role that the organizations play? Is it educational? Do we need to inspire in a different way? How do we realize that outcome?
Oh, yeah. I didn't realize that would be the follow-on question. It's simply because I don't want to get too, political, if you like. A lot of it has got to do with funding and financing, right? So do we have a short-term funding model where the funders want to extract value in a very short time frame, or do we have a longer-term funding model? And the reality is, across the globe today, both exist, right? There are extremely short-term traders all the way up to long-term pension funds and everything in between. But I guess if there were to be a balance more towards the latter, that would certainly, I think, naturally mean that, if you are taking a 10 to 15 year view of the economics of a business or an institution, I think that changes so much, doesn't it? It changes so much around how you perceive things, how you maybe perceive, again, some of those things just outside your immediate purview, because over the lifetime of that 10 to 15 years, failing to recognize those risks will hamper your ability to make money. On a 2-year cycle, you can just take a sort of a tunnel vision and really block out anything external.
You're going to get a second here for your follow-up magic wand proposal, the long-term view, but described in a very in a really interesting way. Well, that's been a whistle-stop tour, as I say, but an absolute delight having you on the show. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time today. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Charlie.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big thank you to Will Ennett for joining me and cutting through the corporate smog surrounding procurement and sustainability. As we've heard, procurement isn't just about securing the best price, it's about securing a future. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by the Andrew Greenwald Charter, championing responsible sustainability communications. Visit andrewgreenwaldcharter.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.